Trigger warning. This episode will be discussing potentially triggering subject matter about residential schools and child abuse. When we get to that section, there will be another warning and directions on how to skip that section and listen to the rest of the episode, which covers positive topics like love, solidarity, and joy. It's not enough to survive in this racialized world. We are learning together to thrive. This is Race, Health, and Happiness, and I'm your host, Dr. O. Today, my guest is Karyn Pugliese, who is a Canadian broadcast journalist and communications specialist of Algonquin and Italian descent. Karyn is the current executive director of Canada's National Observer. Previously, she was the managing editor of investigations at CBC and the executive director of news and current affairs at the Aboriginal Peoples Television Network. She speaks truth to power. She received the National Newspaper Award for Best Columns for 3 powerful pieces written after the discovery of unmarked graves on the grounds of the former Kamloops Indian residential school. Karyn, welcome.
Thank you for having me.
Now, clearly, you are a force to be reckoned with. Right? Like, it's why I say speaking truth to power, like those articles are very, very powerful. And your work, right? Not just those 3 articles, but your whole body of work. And so my understanding is within the industry, you are known as a force to be reckoned with. But what would you say is your superpower?
It might be being stubborn. I think I come from a long line of very stubborn women. It might have been like the primary trait of my mother. And there's a bad point to stubbornness, but there's a good side to stubbornness too. Mm-hmm. That I think a lot of us would recognize this kind of in our moms. Like those moments where they're really stepping up to protect you, or they're really standing by their values, all those things that they teach us. There's an inherent stubbornness there that you're not going to let go of values that are important, that I think I think really got entrained in me.
I can relate to that. And I think, that's been used a lot in popular culture as the term grit, which is what you need to be able to, to accomplish things and to do things. But certainly for mothers who are living in a world where they're experiencing racial oppression, colonial oppression, gender oppression, then that grit becomes survival, right? Yeah. And it's a beautiful thing, actually. Double-edged sword, as you said.
Yeah, because you never win an argument with your mom.
I was going to say, I've caught the other end of that sword, but it's still very, very powerful. So that's very cool. And I think, we'll all hear more about how that particular superpower has led to where you are today and played such an important role in your own path. So with all of, your experience and the work that you've done, you've become kind of, to some extent, the face or a face in Indigenous journalism. Mm-hmm. And so how do you think that happened, or why did that happen?
I have no idea why or how that happened. I think early on in my career, I kind of started at APTN. That was my first full-time journalism gig. I had been...
And APTN is?
Aboriginal Peoples Television Network.
Hey, shout out. All right, go on.
And when they started their newsroom in 2000, I was among the first Indigenous the first journalists hired. I think at that point, all the journalists were Indigenous that they hired. And... I really, there's a point where you become kind of Indian famous. Like, that show was news for us, about us, and other people could listen to it, but we're really a conversation amongst ourselves, is the way the news director, Dan David, put it. And really, there was no social media, there was no Facebook, there was no Twitter. Imagine a world with no Twitter and no Facebook, but it existed. And so you really had to tune into the station and watch to see us. So we were kind of a little bit invisible to the rest of the media world because they weren't paying attention. I left that. I went on to do other things, and where I went back to APTN as the executive director. And I was on the desk, and this is not the point where you think that people are going to start recognizing you, right? Like the hosts, the journalists are the faces that they see on the television every night.
Right. You were like behind the camera. You're not in front of the camera. Right.
And I think one of the first things that I did is after I'd been there for probably like 2 years, like I'd really been focused on just kind of getting the newsroom to work. And solve the problems of the journalists and try to get it to work as efficiently, because that newsroom is always hungry. Like there's not a lot of money, right? So it's always like hungry children that you're just trying to support. So there was a point where I reached out to the Canadian Association of Journalists because they always had an Indigenous panel, and they always asked one of our people to be on the Indigenous panel. But I could see my journalists were doing great investigations, and some of them were great at covering healthcare, and some of them were great at covering the courts and politics. And they have all these panels on all these other things, but we got one person on an Indigenous panel. And I thought, okay, this kind of pisses me off, but I don't think they really know what they're doing, and you're not going to get anywhere by approaching somebody and just kind of yelling at them for something they don't know they're doing wrong. So
really? Because I like doing that sometimes. I've been known to do that, but sorry, go on.
I always try a little honey or a little sugar, before the vinegar.
Yes. I'm with you.
I actually had a great mentor in Rita Deverell, who is in her self-force, and a lot of people don't realize she was a news director at Aboriginal Peoples Television Network for 3 years while she mentored an Indigenous person to take her place. Because she's not Indigenous, she's a Black woman from Texas.
Hey, okay.
Grew up in segregated Texas, so she brought a lot of knowledge and especially about how to get things done when you're hitting these kind of walls, right? And racial barriers.
That's such a beautiful solidarity right there.
Oh, it was.
That I did not know about. But yeah, please.
Yeah,
please
it's amazing. Yeah. Like that's a story that needs to be told more. So I had learned a lot about diplomacy off of her because, diplomacy is not necessarily a trait that's embedded in journalists or trained into us. But I had really watched her work, and I thought, I'm going to channel Rita Deverell. So I called up the president of the CAJ, who was Nick at the time, and said, I'm the executive director of Aboriginal Peoples Television Network, and I would like to speak to you, president of CAJ. And he said, okay. And he was like, what's this about? And I said, well, first, I want to thank you, because you always have a panel about Indigenous people, and you always think of us, and you always invite us. But I just want to let you know that I'd like to participate more and help you if I can. And I know you have these panels on investigations and politics and health and everything else. And if you ever wanted one of our people to be there, I'd be really happy to bring our people to the conference and have them participate even more. And he got it right away because he's like a woke guy. He was like, oh my God, we've completely marginalized you.
No, what year is this? Because I think, if this happened post-2020, it's a totally different story. But this is pre-2020. So
yeah, this is 2013, around there.
Okay. So
yes.
Shout outs to CAJ, shout outs to Rita for, inspiring them. But that's a cool story. And so he got it right away, which is a rare thing.
Got it right away. They invited me in. We to help them organize panels and to get Indigenous people on there. And I would later Nick invited me to run to the board, and then they elected me president of the CAJ. But even before that, just after that initial move, they started including Indigenous people throughout. And it's been that way ever since. And it just
as it should be.
Mm-hmm. But it just took that one move because there was a old way of thinking or not realizing. And you can imagine having these days when they have panels on trauma and journalism and trauma, having an all-white panel, but that's the way it was back then. And It's not that long ago, but it was like that back then.
Yeah, no, I think now it seems incredibly absurd, although still does happen many a time, all white panels or manels or all types of problematic lack of diversity in voices when people are trying to discuss a topic. But I think that's really powerful that that you were able to make that change, particularly at that, at that time, and use your leadership and you know what I mean? All of those pieces in that way. I want to take us back a little bit. I want to rewind because I think that is like a really phenomenal example of how you used your journalism experience. There was solidarity, leadership, and to create change. But my understanding is, you weren't born saying, I'm going to be a journalist. So from what I understand of your story. So maybe if you want to take us back a bit and how you came to become the journalist you are today. How did that path begin for you?
Yeah, well, I was actually I was acting out a lot as a teenager. I think for various reasons, but I think there's young Native girls have a tradition of acting out and making our parents' lives hell. But we've got a lot to act out against.
That's what is, yeah.
It's like I think of, The Simpsons, and there's this one moment where Lisa decides to rebel, and the principal says, what are you rebelling against? She goes, what do you got? So I could give you a long list, but it's a long list of things that probably don't matter right now. But what happened is, like when you punch out like that, like sometimes like you just create more and more trouble and hardship for yourself. And I got to a space where I wasn't functioning well in a regular high school. So I transferred over to an alternative high school. And it was like the best thing that I ever did. It was a small classroom where you kind of have like 8 kids in there. They gave you correspondence books and you just kind of worked on your own time on your high school studies. But there was a lot of support in ways that weren't wonky. Like the teachers there often said that the school was as much for them as it was for us because we were all people that just didn't fit into that mainstream system. And it was in that system that, my dad had been really pushing it. My dad is Italian, and he's like the son of immigrant parents. And going to university was the big thing for him. Like he just wanted me to go to university. He didn't ask me what I wanted to be when I grew up. He asked me which university I was going to go to when I grew up. Yeah, it was so important to him. And here I was dropping out of school and ending up in an alternative school, and it just didn't look like it was going to happen. But one of my teachers said, go into journalism. And just like that. And I was like, why? And he goes, well, you like to write. You're always talking about politics. And he goes, just go. He goes, if you don't go to university, you're going to miss a real opportunity because you're going to find something in there that you like, even if it's not the thing you sign up for. Mm-hmm. But I went and I had that first little exercise of what journalism can do with these kids that it was a small story that we were doing, and there were some kids who needed hockey equipment, and somebody was trying to raise money for them. Mm-hmm. And in doing the story, I was calling around to corporations and just finding out how corporate charity worked. Okay. And then because they were going, what is this hockey team that's at the center of your story? And they ended up getting equipment. And I just thought, well,
oh, wow.
that worked.
Right.
It's not really like I'm not there to advocate, but to give people information and say, here's somebody who's looking for something and you're somebody who does this, introducing you through journalism, like being able to see that power that journalism can have to make change in a really small way. But that was really inspiring, and I kind of got addicted to the idea.
And so where we talk about journalism being an agent of change, I think that definitely can happen. But there's times where journalism reinforces status quo and reinforces harm and stereotypes. And so did you see that in the field of journalism as well? Yeah.
I mean, there's a lot of, especially, I think it's gotten a lot better. But in those early years where, I was starting out as a journalist at APTN, because there's like so many stereotypes about Indigenous people. And one of them was that, a lot of money goes to native reserves and it all gets sucked down this big black hole and it must be going to corrupt chiefs and stuff. And it was the unquestioning of journalists when government has this. Government departments all writing the perfect 8-second soundbite to counteract any proof that Indigenous people are bringing forward. And it's an unfair playing field because even like chiefs don't have that kind of machine behind them, right?
Right.
And certainly the little kokum or the young woman or young man who is trying to express what's happening to them or what's unfair, like that the child welfare system isn't working for them. They don't have, like, they can't, you can't, giving everybody an 8-second clip in that story is not balance. It's a false balance because power is in that 8-second clip, right? Mm-hmm. And the other is somebody just trying to find their words. So one of the things that I saw quite a lot was around, playing on those stereotypes and how government manipulated media and manipulated those stories to reinforce stereotypes. So things like if you were talking about education, the government would say, we already give, X million dollars to First Nations for education. And it just sounds like so much money. And nobody questions and says, well, let's divvy that up. How much is that per kid? Nobody asked that question. Mm-hmm. Later on, the Assembly of First Nations did and came up with those figures to show there was actually severe underfunding happening for First Nations children. But they were just like, wow, that sounds like a lot of money. And they'd go back to the chiefs and go, what do you do with the $60 million that you get? So it's that kind of reinforcement that I would see. Another trick that the government used to do when First Nations were starting to sort of make way in the press and starting to get some empathy, was they'd release chief salaries. And there's always a couple of chiefs who are in the, $100,000. And there's a few questions about that. One, should they be earning that much? Maybe, maybe not. But there's also this reinforcement of, I would say, racism, because like a mayor or a minister doesn't base their salary on how well people are doing. Because otherwise the Minister of Indian Affairs would be paid like nothing.
Right. Yeah.
There's communications officers in the Department of Indian Affairs that make $100,000 a year. Mm-hmm. So why shouldn't a chief, like he's running a community, like there's actually a piece we did on APTN where we looked at what a chief's salary should be, and it settles somewhere around there. But they would create all this shock, like, look at how poor their people are, and they're earning all this money. And then that would just be a few of them. Most chiefs only sit around $60,000, which is nothing, Yeah. And those weren't the ones that got reported on. There's some chiefs that only take in $20,000 a year as salary, and those didn't get reported on. And
I mean, if you consider like the legacy of colonialism, everything that like I presume a chief is dealing with, and the legacy of residential, like all of what we call in medicine the social determinants of health, all of the social factors. In fact, if you were going to actually make it equitable, that chief should be paid more because of all of the battles and barriers that they are overcoming. But instead, it's framed in a certain way. And I'm wondering, because I know sometimes, so I'm using, my lens as a Black woman, sometimes it's, the way government frames it. But of course, a journalist can reframe something from government or call government out for something. And at least when I was young, because I grew up in Quebec and I saw, the Ganawake and, incident and all of that, I don't know what, even the incident is not the right word, but that's how the language that was used at the time.
Pause. We are pausing for clarification here because I was tripping over my words. I said Ganawage incident, but what I meant was the Ganesatake resistance. It was called the Oka crisis by mainstream media, which was using a colonial lens. So I was trying to steer away from that and then fumbled my words. In 1990, Mohawk communities protested plans to extend a golf course onto Indigenous lands, which included burial lands. This was known as the Ganesatake resistance. To learn more about this, check out the show notes for an APTN clip that looks back at that 78-day protest decades later. As for this episode, I asked Dr. Carl to leave in my error and my stuttering in this final cut because I wanted to intentionally show the reality of trying to act in solidarity between BIPOC communities. Sometimes you will stutter literally and figuratively at times as your brain tries to find the right path when you've been taught biased terms and perspectives by our society. My point is, solidarity is more important than perfection in the quest for liberation and for our collective survival as human beings. So we have to unlearn, stutter, learn again, and do better. But keep on keeping on.
And I'm wondering, because I know sometimes, so I'm using, my lens as a Black woman, sometimes it's, the way government frames it. But of course, a journalist can reframe something from government or call government out for something. And at least when I was young, because I grew up in Quebec and I saw, the Ganawake and, incident and all of that, I don't know what even the incident is not the right word, but that's how the language that was used at the time. But the media in itself, like this is part of the legacy of the way people are taught and the lens, right? Yeah. So it's government, but I do wonder about, did you notice things when you were studying journalism or when you began in the field, within the field, in the lens that was used for reporting? Because just because you have a quote doesn't mean that, the person who's writing that article can't say, however, and blah, 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 which is what I see more of today.
Yes.
But I didn't see that, 15 years ago or 20 years ago. But did you observe that yourself at the time? Or did you not, it wasn't a big deal in that time period of your life?
I didn't see a lot of journalists in those days pushing back. There were a couple. There was Sue Bailey for CP, who was really good and pushed back on those things. But there certainly wasn't a lot, and I think it was it's just plain an ignorance, a lack of knowledge on their part, or a belief in authority. So when you had something like the Stony Pointers taking back the land at Ipperwash and police going in, guns ablazing in the middle of the night, shooting at unarmed people, they said Dudley George, who they killed, had a gun. And all the reporters reported that. There was no gun. There was one Star reporter, and I can't remember who it was, but they went down on the ground after everything happened and the shootout happened, and they asked people there, did you have guns? And they said, well, if we did, don't you think we would have hit something? There were no bullets in the police cars, no firing back. And yet, article after article, and John Miller, who was a professor here, at TMU, he actually did a report that surveyed all the media and all the things they reported wrongly about that incident, and it had standing before the Ipperwash inquiry.
Wow. Okay. So, that's powerful to actually do that type of report to kind of just show all of the false reporting that occurred. And so when you started out in journalism, did you decide that you wanted to bring a different narrative? Was that the case right away? My understanding is, I think you left journalism for a little while, but I don't know if it was because of, the nature of journalism or it was other factors. But did you know from the beginning that you wanted to bring that voice and that narrative? And how was that process?
Well, I was really lucky because APTN had just started.
And
okay. So, they were looking for Indigenous journalists, and they called my school. I just graduated from Carleton, and they were talking to a professor. And this is funny because people can't see me, but I'm light-skinned. And I think this is what he meant. They called the professor and they said, do you have any more Indigenous graduates from journalism? And so he called me up and he goes, I think they're hiring and they're really serious. And I asked them and they don't care what you look like.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah.
Okay.
I won't say his name because he didn't mean it. Right? I think he meant that I don't present necessarily as Indigenous, right? Right. I can pass, So... anyways, but getting into that newsroom, was fabulous because I just met a bunch of people. Like, we were this ragtag small group being led by Dan David, who's this visionary leader. And he was just like, how should news be different if we were going to change everything? Well, and here's a connection for you, because Dan had left the CBC. He was frustrated. He's Mohawk. He had covered Kanesatake and was running into problems where people were saying he was biased because he was from there. But he wasn't biased. He was just asking those types of questions that you and I just talked about that other reporters stopped short and didn't ask. And he got frustrated and he started to do work teaching. And he went over to South Africa, where apartheid was ending, and was helping Black journalists take control of newspapers there.
Pause. Did you notice that this is the second story of African Indigenous solidarity that Karyn has told us? The first was about Rita Deverell, a Black woman and one of the first directors of the Aboriginal Peoples Television Network, from whom Karyn learned a lot about diplomatic advocacy. According to APTN, under Rita's leadership, the station grew from a twice-weekly newscast to a daily newscast by 2002. Now, Karyn is telling the story of Dan David, a Mohawk man and the very first director of APTN, who was inspired by his experience in South Africa working with African journalists. These are great stories. In our fight against oppression, I believe we must learn from each other and help each other. This is exactly why the guests on this podcast are diverse BIPOC folks. We cannot be well until we understand that our well-being, our humanity, and struggle is intricately tied to the well-being and struggle of others.
Well, and here's a connection for you, because Dan had left the CBC. He was frustrated. He's Mohawk. He had covered Kanesatake and was running into problems where people were saying he was biased because he was from there. But he wasn't biased. He was just asking those types of questions that you and I just talked about that other reporters stopped short and didn't ask. And he got frustrated and he started to do work teaching. And he went over to South Africa, where apartheid was ending, and was helping Black journalists take control of newspapers there. It opened his eyes.
I got goosebumps.
Yeah, I know. Isn't this crazy?
Oh my goodness. I love this solidarity. Okay, go on. Please.
Yeah, so he started seeing apartheid in South Africa. He came back to Canada. Of course, it's not the same thing. And yet the treatment of people, the white supremacy, like the threads of how you get treated are the same. And so...
Yeah, and I mean, that's not a coincidence, because when white South Africans were designing apartheid, they came over here to see how Indigenous people were treated, and that is part of their blueprint. So it's not
because they had a reserve system too, that's
correct.
Right.
Yes, so it's not a coincidence.
Yeah, so when he came back, he had like that experience and said, well, let's put a little bit of that into APTN. So APTN had this like cheekiness about it. It started out with sort of we're going to be a Western model, but who says that all these rules have to be rules and we're going to question everything?
Oh, I like it.
Yeah, and he actually my first job was like covering Parliament, which like how is that anybody's first job in journalism? But he let me and this other reporter loose on Parliament. And we were just we were just crazy up there. I made sure to wear my buckskin jacket, and we'd laugh and say, "Do you think they know which one is APTN, who's the Indian?" And we just didn't behave the way other reporters behaved, and it wasn't even because we were trying to be different. He just let us be us. And one of the things in like Indigenous cultures, you don't really have these hierarchies. So, I mean, I guess we didn't know we were supposed to be so respectful of the minister and not crack a joke when we were interviewing him, yell down the hallway. And at first the minister wouldn't talk to us. So we went up every single day and just...
Wait.
Yeah.
Why wouldn't the minister talk to you?
That is a great question. He claimed later that he'd been a little shy.
And the minister was shy.
A little media shy, I guess.
Media shy. Interesting. Specifically to APTN?
Specifically to APTN. I mean,
That's an interesting type of shyness where it's only towards Indigenous folks.
Yeah.
Sorry, go on.
It was.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So we went up every day with a mic, and I shouted out, "Minister, Minister, Minister." And, we shot the back end of him running away from the mic, and we played kind of a reel, like,
That's fantastic.
I was trying to ask this question, and then one day he stopped, and I didn't even know what I was supposed to ask him because I'd just gotten so used to going out.
The routine.
And shouting out at
The
him.
jog.
But
The
yeah.
morning jog. Okay, yes. But that is really, really, really cool. I also love that you folks recorded him running.
See, it's just the type of thing that you wouldn't do in a CBC or other news stations. It was, and Dan just let us do it, and it was that kind of stubbornness.
Yeah, that superpower, the stubbornness. Mm-hmm. And how do you feel that it was received by Indigenous communities? Because you said it was, it was brand new, right? Like this new way of telling the news, as you said, like our conversation, right? An internal conversation. So how was that received at the time?
There were a few things that didn't work. We were going to take ourselves out of the stories and just do very... not have the journalist present in the story, do kind of a cinema verite kind of thing. And people hated it. They wanted to see us. They wanted to see who the storytellers were. So we ended up pulling things back a little bit from what we fantasized. But right away, we had people who couldn't wait. They're like, oh my God, there's APTN News. And they came running in with documents and telling us, come to our community. We're going to block a road tomorrow, That was one of my first big stories, was the roadblock. And these people had come down from this remote community in Quebec with all this documentation. And it was a logging dispute that was going on. And, we're like, can you come? Can you come? Mm-hmm. And, like I said, APTN was so small back then. And this is the story. The kids at APTN get tired of hearing this, but we didn't have a vehicle. So, we didn't have a company vehicle. We didn't have an editing suite. We had to shoot everything and then mail the tapes because we didn't. We couldn't afford feeds, fiber feeds, and the internet wasn't fast enough to feed video at the time. So we went up in my cameraman's car, and he had an emergency with his family, so he left me in the community so I could shoot, and I hitchhiked back.
Wow.
And then I went down and I wrote my story and printed up the paper and mailed the tapes to Winnipeg, where an editor there assembled it for television. And that was old school APTN, yeah.
That is some superpower magic right there. That is determination, the whole team determination. But that's powerful. And I think that's amazing, history. You know what I mean? As far as the foundation.
Okay, folks. Coming up next, we are about to have a difficult discussion that touches on the ongoing trauma of residential schools and child abuse. If this is a difficult, traumatizing topic for you, please skip ahead by 14 minutes and restart the podcast at 47 minutes and 30 seconds on the timeline.
Okay, so I'm thinking now, let's fast forward a little bit. And now you're at the National Observer.
Yeah.
And, you wrote, 3 really phenomenal articles that resulted in the award. Because I don't want to just make it sound like you wrote only 3 articles, but those particular 3 articles and ones that I've read about the Kamloops residential school is not even the right word, but anyway, schools. And so how did you decide, because now this is a different audience, right? With the National Observer. How did you come about deciding to write it? And there's a lot of speaking truth to power in those articles. What was your process? How did all of that unfold for you?
Yeah, well, I actually I was hesitating on whether I should write anything or not, because it is one of those spaces. My family, as far as I know, nobody went into residential school. We're not really sure with my mom said my grandfather didn't, maybe he did. But there's like a disconnect between my mom and her father. That relationship was quite broken. So we don't always know what all his life experiences were. I do know he was educated. He could read and write English, but where he learned it, I don't know. So I always feel like there's this, I'm a journalist, and this is around the time where the graves of what was thought to be 215, but I think it's 200 children now that they realize, or 200 graves now, that they've better identified what they've seen. So anyways, this was the discovery of the graves at Kamloops. And I was wondering, should I say anything because I'm not a survivor? And I was kind of back and forth on whether or not I should write. And I wasn't actually employed by the Observer, like as a staff member at the time. I was still working here at the university, but they had asked me to write opinion pieces or columns for them. And they asked me to write, and I was like, okay, let me think about how I would do this. And I really was conscious that I was writing for a non-Indigenous audience. Yeah. And so I thought, I have to write this in a way that they can follow me and they can follow what I'm saying. But it also has to sound true to my community, so that I'm writing it with the survivors in mind. So I read it once thinking I'm reading it as somebody who doesn't understand Indigenous people or the experience. And then I read it again and I imagine that I'm one of the elders who I've interviewed over the years, reading it to see how they're going to feel about it.
That in of itself just gave me goosebumps, because I think that's so powerful. I think sometimes and it doesn't have to be in journalism, but many of us who experience systemic racism or other forms of oppression, we want to do something in the public or, broadly, we tend to only center whiteness and to give a story so that we're thinking about the white person who's going to read it or listen to it, and not remember, the people who have been affected or our own people and how they're going to receive that message, how they're going to be depicted. And so I think that's just such a beautiful thing that you understood it was important for this non-Indigenous audience to hear your voice, and, and you're amplifying voices of community because it's not your history, but at the same time, taking in mind how that person in the community who would have been a survivor would feel reading it. I've never heard that approach before. Maybe that's something that is now taught at, in journalism school, but I've never heard that approach before. So I just wanted to just highlight that is so powerful and important. And I want to thank you for that gift, because I think many of us who have different journeys need to do more of that.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think it is something that, I picked up when I was covering our communities for our communities, because you're not always going in and telling a great story. Sometimes you're talking about conflict in the community and you're talking about things that make people uncomfortable. And so, you have to have a reason to do it. Mm-hmm. Why is the reason that I'm going in and, airing people's dirty laundry, as they say. Mm-hmm. And, so there's a public interest and there's a service that somehow telling the story is doing. And then you want to make sure that you're fair and that everybody, like all sides of that story, would say that sounds true. I may not like what that other guy said in the story, but she did a good job, representing also how I feel about it. And I understand why that person has to be in the story. So I read it with those eyes. But, I've got to say the Observer really encouraged me two things. This is something, the power of having a really thoughtful white editor, because this is how I translate the story for an audience that I don't know what they know. and I don't know what they're going to understand, and I don't know if they're going to follow me along on this journey or where I'm going to lose them. And Adrienne Tanner is the one, she's still there as a managing editor, and she's the one who edited those pieces. And she very carefully and very lovingly, I think, went through them, didn't rush them, took extra time and said, let's work on this another day. And really went through and said, okay, here is where I'm not understanding. What do you mean? And there were a few things like, I was talking about the point system in there where when survivors were initially trying to get compensation, the government had come up with this ridiculous point system. And there were things in there like, if you were abused in one province, you got less points than another province, or being abused by a Protestant priest was worth more than being abused by a Catholic priest.
So they quantified the trauma that children experienced in the residential system in some bizarre, arbitrary, inhumane manner, and people had to describe this in order to receive some sort of small compensation for their suffering and their family's suffering. Is that?
That's right. And if you couldn't get enough points, then you couldn't get compensation. And the points were not being given for cultural loss, not being given for being kidnapped out of your parents' home. They wouldn't recognize any of that. It was just, were you sexually abused enough and by the right people? And were you physically abused enough and by the right people? And enough had to be some sort of permanent damage.
And this was the system prior to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which you talk about only happened, like there was a lot of political motivation for that and advocacy that had to go into that. But that system that you described, the point system, when I read that article, I think I had a sense of that, but when you broke it down in the way that you did, it really hit me just, again, how inhumane and insensitive that was, but that a whole body or committee of people sat down and designed this, knowing what we, all, everybody understands today, just the cruelty that children faced. And even when I think about, the unmarked graves, like I told you, I have 5 and 6 year olds, right? Because that's the age that children. And so I can't imagine. And then living that and then having to have your life put in a point system. So in that article, I think, certainly I didn't know all of, those types of details. And you just did such a phenomenal job of walking us through that story of injustice and just cruelty. So.
Yeah, and really for the Observer, which mainly focuses on climate change, I mean, this was them reaching outside what they normally cover in order to make space for this. And when Adrienne was editing that, when she I knew I'd really hit on something at that moment, because she said, "Are you sure about this?" And I was yeah, I can link to the reports. And she goes, "I think we have to link to the reports because nobody's going to believe this."
And I'm familiar with having to do that even on, stories on slavery and things like that, where it's you have to hyperlink or hyper-reference everything because it's so much not in line with the way people perceive Canada, right? And you talk about that looking glass, right? For people's everyday lives who don't have that history and the everyday legacy that lives with us. Did you, while writing those stories for the National Observer, did you experience times where you had to step away or just, you know what I mean? Experience the writing in your heart? Because I certainly in my own life, having to write certain things, sometimes I found it triggering, even if it wasn't the same experience, but I would have to say, whoa, I need a moment, but I'm not a journalist. So did you already have a process in place when you have to do this, or do you have a process Did it have that impact, or you've been doing this long enough that you have a way of it not squeezing at the heart and impacting the writing?
Yeah, no, it squeezes at the heart. And I think, I think sometimes when I'm writing, I can kind of get lost in the writing, and it's kind of a little bit afterwards that it kind of hits you. So, there's a vicarious trauma, because when I'm retelling those stories, I remember how I felt. Like when I was in that room listening to survivors' testimonies back in, it was 2006, I think. I was working the camera. When you go into committee rooms, you have to ask permission to bring a camera in. So I brought the camera in and I was working it myself. And there was a point where I was just behind the camera and I was just crying because some of the stories got so bad. I didn't put the worst ones in there. But and there was tissue out on the table, and I didn't want the MPs to see me crying, because you're not supposed to, you're supposed to be objective. And
which doesn't exist. But anyways, but you were being human, and that's apparently not allowed. But
yeah,
go on.
And I think there's a difference between being objective doesn't mean you can't have empathy. But I didn't know that back then, because that wasn't what we were taught in J school. And so I eventually had to reach out and get the Kleenexes. But then I looked around, and then, there were politicians of all stripes, NDP, Liberals, Conservatives. They all had tears in their eyes, too. It was hard to listen to. And I think they knew, like, they had created a monster with that compensation system. So it does bring that back. I remember going home from that. You talk about having kids. I had a young son at home. I remember going home and looking at him and just figuring the size of him and how strong he was. And there's that one story about the woman who said that the priest beat her until he was so tired he had to stop to take a breath so he could beat her again. And I'm looking at my kid and I'm thinking, how hard would I have to beat him, and how long before I lost my breath? And then he looks and goes, "Mom, why are you looking at me like that?" And you're like, oh my God, what's even going through my head, right? And so I think what I try to do is, like, it's very easy to get angry. And as I said, I was once a very angry young woman acting out. And there's nothing wrong with moral outrage, but that's different than the kind of anger where you want to lash out, and doing this work can give you those feelings. So what I always do is I always take a deep breath and I remind myself that I'm working from a place of love. I love these people. I love how strong they were. I love how hard they fought. I want to see them have justice. And so I'm going to write from a place of love for them. And that's I think, how I keep it under control.
Pause. Can I just celebrate the wisdom in what Karyn just shared? Working with love. This is such a good coping mechanism for all of us, writers and non-writers. It is so important to try to work from a place of love despite systemic oppression. Now, of course, we all have the right to be angry. I've been angry. At times I have stayed angry. The anger is justified. But after a while, if you don't channel it in a healthy way, you will poison yourself. Long-term anger and hostility can lead to increased risk of heart disease, hormone dysfunction, and inflammation in the body. So I think it's healthy to do what Karyn does. Speak truth to power and honor community voices in a spirit of love. To quote the late great African-American author Bell Hooks, and I quote, "When we work with love, we renew the spirit. That renewal is an act of self-love. It nurtures our growth. It is not what you do, but how you do it." End quote. Now, while I'm in this warm and fuzzy mood, I'm also going to add a special shout out to Karyn's editor at Canada's National Observer. It is led by folks with power and privilege, but they were willing to disrupt their standard practice of reporting on climate change and environmental issues. They created the space for Karyn to amplify voices that needed to be heard, and for Karyn to do it her way, with love.
The Race, Health, and Happiness podcast will be right back after these short messages. Yeah.
The Race, Health, and Happiness podcast is produced with the support of Toronto Metropolitan University. We are proud to be partnered with TMU, a school that has committed itself to addressing its colonial past, doing its anti-racism work, and moving forward with a mandate to provide an equitable and inclusive learning environment.
I hope you're enjoying this episode so far, and there's more to come. This podcast is made possible by our sponsors and partners, but we need your help too. We have set up a Patreon account, and the funds go towards supporting our students, specifically Black journalism students who work very hard on this podcast, and we make it a point to pay them. The link is patreon.com/RaceHealth&Happy, and you can also find it in the show notes. And check us out on Twitter, Instagram, or LinkedIn. Our handle is @RaceHealth&Happy.
And now back to the Race, Health, and Happiness podcast.
So what I always do is I always take a deep breath and I remind myself that I'm working from a place of love. You know, I love these people. I love how strong they were. I love how hard they fought. I want to see them have justice. And so I'm going to write from a place of love for them. And that's I think how I keep it under control.
I think that's beautiful. And I think when you work from a place of love, that allows that compassion for others and compassion for yourself, I imagine. Is that something that you think is important for, let's say we have, an Indigenous Day school student who's listening in right now. What would be your advice now that you've gone through this journey for them?
Yeah, I think probably the best advice I can give is at the moments where you're going through this and you're having those struggles, you really do need to talk to people. And I know it's a little bit, people hate this when you're like, yeah, but I'm the one who's kind of going through something and now I have to do the one who practices self-care and like, why isn't anybody helping me? When at the moments where I was going through, I figured it out. But there were a lot of times where I should have reached out to somebody and I didn't. And because I figured it out on my own, I wasn't always the best boss. I wasn't paying attention the way I needed to pay attention to what my reporters were going through. And here's the thing that you really need to understand from the reporter-boss relationship when you're on the reporter side, now that I've been on the boss's side. When you're a reporter and you're going through and you're interviewing people, you're hearing a lot of stuff that your boss never knows that you're hearing. You're editing something maybe for television or for radio and you're rewinding it and you're looking for the clip and you're playing the clip over and over again to get it just exactly right. And your boss doesn't realize that you're doing that because they're not sitting there beside your shoulder. All they see is the fit to print piece where you've cut out all the worst stuff and you've very carefully, ethically chosen what you need to make the point. But there's all that stuff on the cutting room floor that you experienced. And I forgot about that when I was a boss. I forgot, like I would see the piece come in, I would say it's a great piece, and my reporter seemed to be okay, and I wasn't checking in as much as I should have checked in. So I make it a practice now, you know, whether I know what's going on with my reporters or not, whether they're just covering something that maybe they're doing all joyful stories this month, like all solutions journalism, but I still don't know. So I check in once a month and we can just talk about news. We can talk about what's bothering them about the business. We can talk about anything, vacations, whatever, but it's just their time with me to bring up anything. And I think reporters need to ask for that space. And, you know, you can manage up, you can teach bosses. I mean, the way that I found out is I was doing this report on like what it's like to be Indigenous women journalists in Canada. Nobody had ever asked before. So UNESCO had commissioned this report. So I was writing it for them, and I'm interviewing people, and some of them were my own employees. And I was waiting for them to say, "Oh, you were the best boss. You were just so woke and so kind.
You're the best."
Yeah, just gave me everything I needed, you know, because these are the ones that liked me when I'm interviewing. And they laid it out, and they said, "You let us down." You know, and I was like, I wanted to say, yeah, but you didn't tell me. Yeah, but we have healthcare. Yeah, but we had elders. Yeah, but. And you can't but somebody when they're saying none of that stuff worked. You still needed to do something else. And so, you know, I'm still trying to figure out if I've quite got it right. But for young reporters, you know, you've got to self-care, but you've got to have the bravery to ask for that time and that space.
I think these are, although you're putting it in the context of journalism, I think these are the things that we're all, you know, grappling with as, you know, Black folk, Indigenous folk, people of color, because when we're more junior, we're experiencing it in all directions. And then when we become more senior or, you know, get promotions, we're still managing our own and may not have, as you said, not have learned like the best ways to manage them. And then we're supposed to role model. And that's a huge weight to carry. But I think it's so beautiful that you're reflecting on it. And as, you know, as Maya Angelou said, when we know better, we do better. And that's all we can do. Right?
Yeah.
Speaking though, so let's shift it of knowing better and either doing better or maybe pretending to do better. The Pope was just here.
Yes.
And we're not going to, you know, spend a huge amount of time on that because I don't want to. But I do want to. I'm curious about your perspective, understanding that you are not a representative of all groups and all nations who are Indigenous, but what your perspective is on the Pope issuing, you know, an apology for the atrocities that occurred as a result of colonialism in the residential schools. But overall, his apology was about individuals and not about the institution and not about the doctrine of discovery. Do you personally see that? And if you don't want to speak personally, you can speak broadly, but as propaganda or progress? What was that? Because I have my opinion, but go ahead.
Well, you know, I think the thing that, you know, like, what I was thinking is I was thinking about the layers of generations and how people accept things. So you have like Willie Littlechild, who had gifted the headdress to the Pope. And honestly, the first picture, I thought it was some Photoshop joke that somebody had done. I didn't realize that it actually happened.
Yikes. Yeah.
Yeah, and it did kind of look like the photo's kind of odd, like the expression on his face. And but I did say also that there was something also powerful about seeing our spirituality imprinted on him because, you know, like that's a real reversal of the relationship. And later on, I found out because a reporter who sometimes works for us, Brandy Moran, she went down, she asked Willie Littlechild why he did it. And it was his father's headdress. And it was a family decision, and he has every right to gift that, right? But I think it was representative of his generation and how they're receiving the moment, which is really different than a lot of people. So we have a young Indigenous reporter working in Ottawa for us, Mateo Similero, And he spent a week doing a lot of these stories and trying to get just the diversity of reaction out there so that like we were representing like various points of views. And I think trying to come to an understanding. And we're going to be running a piece next week on where the Pope didn't go, which was another St. Anne's mission where a lot of Catholic Mi'kmaq go to every July on a retreat. And that whole piece just focuses on how do you balance spirituality, Catholicism, culture, like how do you reconcile in your heart all of these things, which I think is there's a real tension sometimes in Indigenous communities over, well, you know, if you're Catholic or if you're Christian, you're a sellout because it changed our spirituality. And you know, there was always this can't have both. And so we're trying to find, I think, in coming out of colonialism, I think one of the things that somebody said to me once is the problem with colonialism is we weren't given choices. We weren't, like, people didn't come to us and say, here's something, would you like it? And we got to pick, because that is self-empowerment when you choose. You can choose something from another culture and say, that looks useful to me.
That's true, yeah.
Yeah, and so I think we're coming out of all these things that are forced on us and trying to say, well, what would we have picked? You know, what would have been meaningful for us? So I think this complex answer, what the Pope's apology, what the visit meant, some of it certainly was just, you know, was the church finally trying to do some public relations work. But if it was meaningful to some of the survivors, then I want to let them have that, you know. It's always complicated to reverse colonialism.
I think that's exactly it. I think it's just very complicated, but I like the piece that you said about choice, right? Like where you have the choice. Colonialism removed choice for many of us, and so coming from an African perspective, like some of our nations wear feathers, some of our nations, have engaged, you know, with the Catholic Church for a long time, and the damages are ever present. So yes, that symbolism was, at least from my, you know, African decolonial lens, mixed and problematic. But I think what you said about choice is probably the most that resonates with me. I think I get that, and respect that, and you're right. Decolonization is complex, and we're just one, you know, last thing that I want to ask on the topic of colonialization, when we're and actually you mentioned South Africa, and in South Africa when they were going through their process of truth and reconciliation, you know, Nelson Mandela and the African National Congress at that time really were very focused on engaging like other non-European racialized groups, aside from their interactions with Europeans, on, you know, like there was Indian population, Japanese population, all of them had a role to play in decolonization. I'm wondering, you know, our listeners, particularly those who are, you know, Black, you know, persons of color, but non-Indigenous, do you have any advice on how we can act in solidarity when it comes to decolonization on this land?
Yeah, I mean, I remember reading Desmond Cole's book, and he made space in that book that is primarily about a Black experience in Canada to discuss Indigenous people and the history of Canada, right? Like just these gestures that I think are welcoming, you know, and I think getting to having these conversations. Because for a long time, like, I mean, I think the Indigenous movement, we talked about the connection between APTN and South Africa, right? There's also, there was, you know, AIM, the American Indian movement, was very inspired by the Black movement in the U.S. The red power fist in the air is the same as the Black power fist in the air, right? But I feel like we've had really great conversations since, you know, 2020 and the death of George Floyd. I should say the murder of George Floyd. I think that really opened up a conversation where we just weren't going to hold back anymore, and we were going to support each other in saying it like it is. You know, another connection, because I mean, apartheid, when I was a tween, apartheid was ending in South Africa, and there was a lot of discussion about, you know, how to force it, you know, like what policies other countries should bring in. And the way I first encountered it is through this rock song where a bunch of musicians got together and they said they weren't going to play Sun City. And I had never heard of Sun City. I was a tween. I didn't know anything about South Africa. So that was my way in, was through music and through
And what was Sun City about?
There was Sun City was one of the white resorts in South Africa where vacationers would go. Okay. And so a bunch of Black and white and I suppose other ethnicities got together and made this song just saying that they were banning Sun City and they weren't going to play there. And in taking that stand and writing that song, they made young people like me aware of it. So I started putting my hands on everything I could get to read about this because I was curious and because it connected to me. And my favorite was Biko. And I remember there's this one thing that he said that always stuck with me. And I've thought about this in the field of journalism a lot, is he said, "You damn liberals, we don't want to get a seat at your table. We want to smash your table, build our own, and then we'll invite you to sit at it." Right? And I think in journalism, we as BIPOC people need to go and smash that table and build our own. And there'll be a place for everybody at it, but it's time.
I love that. I had a student who said something similar about, yeah, we don't want to be at that table. We don't even want to be in that room. Let's take it outside.
That's spicy. I love it.
Yes. Shout out to, I don't want to name her, but the medical student who said that. She knows who she is. So as we wrap up, though, and thinking about as we, you know, smash tables and decolonize, all of that is a lot of work. And so what brings you joy?
Oh gosh, so many things. I mean,
good.
There are these moments where you sit there and you realize that history has moved forward, right? And
Yes.
you know, we're talking about one of the things that I really wanted to do in that article was honor those residential school survivors. You know, I said they never had it easy. This was politicized. You know, decisions were made for bureaucratic reasons or for pragmatic reasons, and they had to fight every bit of the way. But even if it took them 150 years to stop that system, they stopped it. And I sometimes think, you know, about the responsibility that I carry, that my kid carries, because it took them 150 years to get me to the point where I'm sitting here having this conversation with you, having a nice life, and I can just feel like gratitude and thankfulness for it, you know, because it was so hard for them to create a world where I could be free.
Gratitude to our ancestors, to all the ancestors. Thank you, Karyn.
Thanks for having me.
The Race, Health, and Happiness podcast was created by Dr. Onye Norum, and she's our host. The show is produced, edited, and engineered by yours truly, Dr. Carl Cabasel. Our technical producer is Obadiah George. Our showrunner is Cam, and JL Joseph is associate producer. Promotions coordinator is Jordan Gibson. Social media coordinator is Efwa Mfojo. And Javiera Violeta Duran Quieres is our logistics coordinator. Awit Siem is our business manager, and Tamika E. Latibaudiere is our research consultant. Additional support from Latoya Powell, our special production consultant, and additional voice work by Durell Carpentier. The RHH theme song is composed and performed by Gold Keys, and graphic design is by Veronica Ng. Do you have questions, feedback, ideas to share? We would love to hear from you. You can connect with us on Instagram and Twitter at RaceHealth&Happy, and check out the show notes for research that was referenced in this episode, as well as other bonus material. Our website is RaceHealth&Happiness.com. Thank you for listening to Race, Health, and Happiness, and please subscribe to us anywhere you get your favorite podcasts. I'm Dr. Carl Cabasel, and we'll talk with you soon.
The Race, Health and Happiness podcast is brought to you with help from Toronto Metropolitan University and with support from subscribers and listeners like you. Overcome the obstacles of racism while staying happy and healthy. Donate today at patreon.com/racehealthhappy. We are learning together to thrive. Thank you for your support. The Race, Health, and Happiness podcast is made better by the skills, knowledge, and creative passion of the journalism students who work right here on the show. These students join us from Toronto Metropolitan University. Thank you for the hard work, folks. We appreciate you.